The German shepherd's claws scraped against granite as she lunged forward, her muscled frame trembling, with an intensity that made the morning air feel electric. Around the memorial, visitors scattered like startled birds, children crying, mothers pulling them back as the dog's deep growl echoed off the black stone walls. "Ranger down!" The command cracked through the chaos, but the dog's amber eyes remained fixed on something no one else could see. Her handler, Staff Sergeant Maya Chen, limped forward on her prosthetic leg, the metal clicking against concrete. In a rhythm that once meant safety, now meant desperation. The veterans' memorial stretched before them like a wound in the earth, thousands of names carved into polished granite, reflecting the pale October sky. Maya's hand found Ranger's collar, but the dog's body was rigid, every muscle coiled like a spring ready to snap. This wasn't protection. This wasn't training. This was something else entirely. "She's never done this before," Maya whispered, more to herself than to the security guard approaching with his hand on his radio. Blood trickled from where Ranger's claws had scraped against the memorial wall, but the dog didn't seem to notice. Her nose pressed against the base of Panel 12, the section dedicated to fallen soldiers from the 82nd Airborne Division. The guard's voice was firm, but cautious. "Ma'am, you need to control your animal." Maya's laugh came out hollow, bitter. Control. She'd lost control of everything else, her career, her leg, her nights without nightmares. But Ranger had been the one constant, the one thing that made sense in a world that had tilted sideways the moment that IED went off in Kandahar. "She's a trained military working dog," Maya said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "She doesn't just react to nothing." But even as she spoke, doubt crept in. Ranger's behavior had been strange for weeks now, whimpering at night, refusing to eat, staring at doors that led nowhere. The vet had found nothing wrong. The behavioral specialist had shrugged and recommended more exercise. Now, watching Ranger's desperate clawing at the memorial's foundation, Maya felt something cold settle in her stomach. The dog's nose was pressed against a specific spot, right below the name Daniel Torres SGT Kia 2019. Maya's breath caught. Danny. She'd been here for Danny. The crowd around them had grown, phones out, recording. Maya could already see the headlines. Crazed military dog attacks memorial. The shame burned through her chest, but she couldn't move, couldn't pull Ranger away, because something in the dog's desperation felt familiar. The same frantic energy Maya had felt in those first weeks after the hospital, when she'd wake up reaching for a leg that wasn't there. "Ranger," she whispered, kneeling beside the animal. "What is it, girl? What do you see?" The dog's whimper was almost human, a sound that seemed to come from somewhere deep and broken. Her paws scraped against the concrete again, but this time, Maya noticed something else. The sound was different here, hollow, echoing, as if there was space beneath the memorial's foundation. The security guard's radio crackled. "We've got a situation at the memorial, need backup." But Maya wasn't listening anymore. She was watching Ranger's eyes, seeing something she'd missed before. This wasn't random. This wasn't a breakdown. This was recognition. "You know something, don't you?" Maya's voice was barely audible. "You know something about this place." Ranger's tail, which had been tucked between her legs, gave a single tentative wag. Then she looked directly at Maya, those amber eyes holding a message that seemed to say, "Finally, finally, you're listening." The memorial's shadow stretched long across the ground, and Maya realized with a jolt that she wasn't just visiting Danny's name on a wall. She was standing at the edge of something much deeper, something that had been waiting in the darkness for someone to find it. And Ranger, somehow, had known all along. 3 years earlier, Forward Operating Base Salerno, Afghanistan, the explosion. That changed everything lasted exactly 2.3 seconds. Maya had counted over and over in the hospital bed afterward, trying to make sense of time that had folded in on itself like paper in a fire. She'd been walking point with Ranger, the dogs. Black Nose working the dusty air for traces of explosive residue. It was supposed to be a routine patrol. Check the perimeter, clear the supply route, get back before the afternoon heat made the metal of their gear too hot to touch. Ranger had been her partner for 18 months by then, and Maya had learned to read the subtle language of the dog's body like scripture. The tilt of her ears meant possible contact. The stiffness of her tail meant danger. The way she'd frozen that morning, head cocked toward a pile of rubble that looked like every other pile of rubble in that godforsaken valley, meant run. Maya had trusted that instinct before. It had saved her unit 3 times. IEDs buried under seemingly innocent debris, insurgents hidden in buildings that looked abandoned, tripwires stretched across paths that appeared clear. But that morning, Lieutenant Morrison had been impatient, pushing them forward despite Ranger's hesitation. "We don't have time for the dog's anxiety," he'd snapped. "Move out." Maya had looked down at Ranger, saw the dog's amber eyes filled with something that looked almost like pleading. "Don't make me go there," those eyes had said. Something's wrong, but orders were orders, and Maya had been a soldier before she'd been a dog handler. She'd given the command to move forward, and Ranger had obeyed, as she always did. Because that's what military working dogs did. They followed their handlers into hell and back, trusting that the human at the other end of the leash knew what they were doing. The IED had been buried deeper than usual, packed with enough explosive to crater the road and turn the morning air into a wall of fire and flying metal. Maya remembered the sound first, not the explosion itself, but the sudden, terrible silence that followed it. Then came the pain, shooting up from where her left leg used to be, and the taste of dust and blood in her mouth. But what haunted her most wasn't her own screams. It was Ranger's howl, high and keening and utterly human in its grief. When the medevac chopper had arrived, the dog had refused to leave Maya's side, had to be physically restrained by 3 men while Maya was loaded onto the stretcher. The right. Last thing Maya remembered before the morphine took her under was Ranger's face pressed against the helicopter's window, watching her disappear into the sky. 2 years earlier, Walter Reed Medical Center. They'd brought Ranger to visit once Maya was stable enough for visitors. The dog had been staying with another handler, a kind-faced corporal named Jessica, who'd been taking care of her while Maya learned to walk again. "She's not eating much," Jessica had said, settling Ranger on the hospital bed beside Maya. "The vet says she's healthy, but Maya could see it in the dog's eyes, the same hollowness that stared back at her from the bathroom mirror every morning. Ranger had lost weight, her glossy coat dulled to a flat black. She moved like an old dog, though she was only 5 years old. Every night, Jessica reported, Ranger would lie by the window, watching the sky. "She's waiting for you to come back," Jessica had said. "She doesn't understand where you went." Maya had buried her face in Ranger's fur, breathing in the familiar scent of dust and determination and something indefinably loyal. The dog's heartbeat was steady against her chest, but slower than Maya remembered. As if part of her had simply stopped running. "I'm here, girl," Maya had whispered. "I'm here." But even as she said it, she knew it wasn't true. The Maya that Ranger had known, the one who'd run 5 miles every morning, who'd never hesitated. When following orders, who'd believed in the mission with every fiber of her being. That Maya had died in the crater along with her leg. This new person, this stranger with metal where bone used to be and nightmares where dreams used to live, was someone else entirely. Ranger seemed to sense it too. She'd stayed close during the visit, but there was a distance in her eyes that hadn't been there before. A question that Maya couldn't answer. "Who are you now?" Present day. Maya's apartment, Virginia. The nightmares had changed over the years. In the beginning, they'd been simple replays. The explosion, the pain, the helicopter blades chopping through smoke-filled air. But lately, they'd become more complex, layered with images that didn't make sense. Danny Torres had started appearing in them 6 months ago. Not the Danny she'd known, the quick-grinned sergeant who'd taught her to play poker and had shared his grandmother's cookies from home. This Danny was older, sadder, his uniform torn and dirty. He'd stand at the edge of her dreams, just out, of reach, his mouth moving like he was trying to tell her something urgent. But in dreams you can never quite hear what the dead are trying to say. Maya would wake with Ranger pressed against her side, the dog's amber eyes alert and watching. Sometimes she wondered if Ranger saw the same dreams, if that's why she'd grown so restless lately. Dogs were supposed to be able to sense things humans couldn't. Spirits, emotions, danger lurking in the shadows. What if Ranger was sensing something Maya couldn't see? The thought had been eating at her for weeks, growing stronger every time. She noticed Ranger's strange behavior, the way the dog would stare at empty corners, the way she'd whimper when they passed certain streets, the way she'd started sleeping by the door, as if she was guarding against something that only she could perceive. And then there was the memorial. Maya had been avoiding it for 3 years, but Danny's anniversary was coming up, and she'd finally worked up the courage to visit, to say goodbye properly, to maybe find some peace. She'd never expected Ranger to find something else entirely. The groundskeeper's name was Harold, and he'd been tending the memorial for 12 years. His weathered hands shook slightly as he led Maya and Ranger away from the crowds toward a maintenance shed tucked behind a grove of oak trees. "Never seen anything like it," he said, his voice rough with decades of cigarettes. "Dogs come here all the time, service dogs, therapy dogs, family pets. They're usually calm, respectful even. But your girl there," he glanced at Ranger, who was pressed against Maya's leg, still trembling with barely contained energy. "She's not reacting to the memorial. She's reacting to something under it." Maya's pulse quickened. "What do you mean under it?" Harold pulled out a key ring that looked like it held the secrets of the universe, jingling through options until he found the right one. The memorial was built on an old site, used to be a small cemetery way back. Most of the graves were relocated when they built the memorial, but he paused, studying Maya's face. There were some discrepancies in the records, a few graves that couldn't be properly identified or moved. The shed door opened with a creak that made Maya's teeth ache. Inside, filing cabinets lined the walls, stuffed with papers yellow with age. Harold pulled out a thick folder and spread blueprints across a dust-covered table. "Here," he said, pointing to a section of the memorial's foundation. "Panel 12. There's a small chamber beneath it, about 6 feet down. City records from the 1950s mention it, but it was sealed when the memorial was constructed. No one's opened it in decades." Maya stared at the blueprints, her mind racing. Panel 12. Danny's section, the exact spot where Ranger had been clawing. "What's in the chamber?" Harold shrugged. "Officially, nothing. Just an old burial vault that was deemed too historically significant to disturb," but he hesitated, then pulled out another folder. "There have been other incidents, not like today, but strange things." The folder contained newspaper clippings, spanning 30 years. Maya's eyes skimmed the headlines. "Visitors report unusual sounds at Veterans Memorial. Local man claims to hear voices from Memorial Wall. Psychic investigators request access to memorial grounds." "Most of it's probably nonsense," Harold said quickly. "Grief makes people see things that aren't there, but some of the reports are consistent. Sounds coming from underground, whispers. Sometimes people claim to hear tapping like someone trying to get out." Ranger whimpered, pressing closer to Maya. The dog's ears were pinned back, but her eyes remained alert, scanning the shadows of the shed as if she expected something to emerge from them. Maya's hand found Ranger's head, stroking the familiar softness of her ears. The gesture was automatic, comforting, but as her fingers moved through the dog's fur, she noticed something that made her heart skip. Ranger's muscles were tense, coiled, but it wasn't the tension of fear. It was the tension of recognition, of purpose. "Harold," Maya said slowly, "what if the sounds people are hearing aren't from the past?" The old man's eyes narrowed. "What do you mean?" "I mean, what if there's something down there that's still alive?" That evening, Maya's apartment. Maya sat on her living room floor, surrounded by papers she'd printed from every online archive she could find. Ranger lay beside her, closer than usual, her head resting on Maya's good leg. The dog hadn't eaten since their visit to the memorial, but she hadn't left Maya's side either. The deeper Maya dug into the memorial's history, the more questions arose. The land had indeed been a cemetery, but the records were incomplete. Several grave sites had been listed as unrecoverable during the relocation process, but there was no clear explanation of why. Some files were missing entirely, marked only with stamps that read classified or access restricted, but it was the military records that made Maya's blood run cold. Daniel Torres had been reported KIA in Afghanistan in 2019, but the circumstances of his death were murky. His unit had been involved in a classified operation, details redacted in every official report. The only concrete fact was that his body had been recovered and returned to the United States for burial, except Danny wasn't. Buried in Arlington, as Maya had assumed, according to the funeral home records she'd managed to track down, his body had been interred in a private ceremony at Forest Lawn Cemetery, 30 miles outside the city. His name on the memorial was purely honorary. So why had Ranger reacted so strongly to that specific spot? Maya pulled up Danny's military service record, cross-referencing dates and locations. He'd been deployed to Afghanistan twice, but never at the same time as Maya. Their paths had crossed stateside during training, exercises and brief overlaps between deployments. But there was something else, something that made Maya's stomach twist with unease. Danny had been a dog handler too. His partner had been a Belgian Malinois named Scout, a specialized detection dog trained in explosive ordnance disposal. According to the records, Scout had been killed in the same incident that claimed Danny's life. Maya's hands stilled on the keyboard. She looked down at Ranger, who was watching her with those intelligent amber eyes. The dog's tail gave a single, tentative wag. "You knew him, didn't you?" Maya whispered. "You knew Danny and Scout." As if in response, Ranger rose and padded to the window. She stood on her hind legs, paws pressed against the glass, looking out toward the city lights. But Maya had the distinct impression that Ranger wasn't looking at the lights. She was looking beyond them, towards something only she could see. The next morning, Veterans Affairs Office Maya had called in every favor she could think of, but the bureaucracy was a wall of polite refusals and stamped denials. The classified nature of Danny's final mission meant that details of his death were locked away in files that would never see daylight. The Memorial Foundation was equally unhelpful. They maintained the memorial, they said, but had no involvement in what lay beneath it. But Maya had learned patience in the army and persistence in the hospital. She'd spent 3 years learning to walk again. She could spend a few more days learning the truth. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Jessica, the corporal who'd cared for Ranger during Maya's recovery, had stayed in touch over the years. When Maya called her explaining the situation, Jessica's response was immediate and chilling. "Danny Torres," she said, her voice tight with recognition. "I remember him. He was at the training facility the same time as you and Ranger." "But Maya, there's something you need to know." Maya's grip tightened on the phone. "What?" "Danny didn't die in Afghanistan. He died here, stateside. The official reports were falsified." The words hit Maya like a physical blow. "What are you talking about?" "I can't say much over the phone, but there was an incident. A training accident." "That wasn't really an accident. Danny was investigating something that certain people didn't want investigated. He and Scout were killed to keep them quiet." Maya's apartment suddenly felt too small, the walls pressing in around her. Ranger seemed to sense her distress, moving closer until her warm body was pressed against Maya's legs. "Jessica, if you know something, I know that Danny was asking questions about a program, a Black Ops program that used military working dogs for questionable purposes. And I know that 3 days before he died, he told me he was going to hide evidence somewhere safe, somewhere only another dog handler would think to look." The phone line crackled with static, or maybe it was the sound of Maya's world shifting on its axis. "The memorial," Maya said. "He hid something at the memorial." "Maybe. But Maya, if I'm right, then the people who killed Danny are still out there. And if Ranger found what they've been looking for all these years..." The line went dead. Maya stared at the phone, her heart hammering against her ribs. Ranger was watching her, those amber eyes filled with something that looked like urgency, like time running out. Outside, the city hummed with its usual rhythms, traffic, construction, the distant sound of sirens. But Maya felt like she was standing in the eye of a storm, surrounded by a silence that was about to shatter. She looked at Ranger, who was still pressed against her legs, solid and warm and impossibly loyal. The dog who'd followed her into hell and back, who'd waited by hospital windows for her return, who'd somehow led her to a truth that had been buried for 3 years. "We have to go back," Maya said. "Don't we, girl? We have to go back and find what Danny left behind." Ranger's tail wagged once, a sharp, decisive movement that looked almost like a salute. Hours later, Veterans Memorial, 6 a.m. The memorial was different in the pre-dawn darkness, quieter, more reverent, with only the soft glow of security, lights casting long shadows between the granite panels. Maya had called ahead this time, arranging for an official visit through the Memorial Foundation. Harold had been surprisingly cooperative, agreeing to meet them before the grounds opened to the public. "Brought the paperwork," he said, his breath visible in the cold morning air. "Legal permission to examine the foundation around Panel 12. Took some doing, but the board finally agreed, especially after I showed them the structural concerns." Maya raised an eyebrow. "Structural concerns?" Harold's smile was thin. "Amazing what you can find when you look close enough. Hairline cracks in the concrete, potential settling issues. Nothing dangerous, but enough to justify a thorough inspection." Ranger was calmer today, but Maya could sense the tension coiled in the dog's muscles. They'd spent the previous day together, just the two of them, walking familiar trails and sharing, the kind of comfortable silence that only came with years of partnership. Maya had needed that grounding, that reminder of who they were to each other. Now, standing before Panel 12 again, she felt ready for whatever they might find. The ground-penetrating radar equipment arrived at 6:30, operated by a surveyor named Marcus, who asked no questions and worked with the efficiency of someone who'd seen stranger things. The machine hummed as it passed over the concrete, sending invisible pulses into the earth below. "There's definitely a void space," Marcus said, studying the readout on his screen. "About 6 feet down, roughly the size of a phone booth, and there's something inside it. Multiple objects from the looks of it." Maya's pulse quickened. "Can you tell what they are?" "Metal objects, mostly. And this is interesting. There's some kind of container. Looks like it might be waterproof, military grade." "Maybe," Harold nodded grimly. "We'll need to excavate, carefully. The memorial board will want to observe, and we'll need to document everything for the historical record." The excavation took most of the morning. Maya watched from behind the yellow tape as workers carefully removed sections of concrete and earth, revealing the outline of a small chamber. Ranger sat beside her, alert but patient, as if she understood that this was part of a larger process. At 11:47 a.m., they broke through. The chamber was exactly as the radar had indicated, a small concrete-lined space that had been sealed for decades. Inside, wrapped in heavy plastic and military-grade containers, were Danny's final gifts to the world: documents, hundreds of them, photographs, video recordings, financial records, and sworn statements from soldiers who'd witnessed things that were never supposed to see daylight. The evidence of a program that had used military working dogs not just for detection and patrol work, but for experimental procedures that violated every law of military conduct. Project Cerberus, Harold. Read from one of the files, his voice hushed. "Jesus Christ." Maya's hands shook as she read over his shoulder. Dogs used as test subjects for chemical weapons, animals subjected to psychological torture to enhance their aggression. Handlers who'd refused to participate found themselves reassigned to dangerous missions, their objections buried in classified files. And at the center of it all, a network of officers who'd profited from the program, selling military secrets to foreign buyers and eliminating anyone who threatened to expose them. "Danny found all this," Maya said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He died trying to stop it." Harold was already on his phone, calling the FBI. Maya could hear him explaining the situation, requesting immediate assistance, emphasizing the national security implications. Within an hour, the memorial would be crawling with federal agents, the evidence secured, the investigation officially begun. The killers who'd silenced Danny Torres were about to face justice. Maya knelt beside, Ranger burying her face in the dog's fur. "You did it, girl. You found what he wanted us to find." Ranger's tail wagged, but there was something different in the dog's posture, a tension that hadn't been there moments before. Her ears were pricked forward, focused on something beyond. The excavation site. "Ma'am," one of the workers called out, "there's something else down here. Looks like a second chamber." Maya's blood chilled. The radar had shown only one void space. This was something new, something that had been hidden even deeper than Danny's evidence cache. Harold appeared beside her, his face pale. The original blueprints didn't show a second chamber. This is something else entirely. The worker's voice drifted up from the excavation. It's not empty, oh God, there's someone down here. Ranger's growl started low, building to a rumble that seemed to come from the earth itself. The dog's hackles rose, her amber eyes fixed on the darkness below, and Maya realized with a growing sense of horror that they hadn't found Danny's evidence cache at all. They'd found Danny's grave. The bones were old, but not ancient. Scattered and broken, mixed with scraps of military uniform and dog tags that had been deliberately damaged to obscure identification. But there was enough left to tell the story, a story that made Maya's legs give out beneath her, sending her crashing to her knees on the cold earth. Sergeant Daniel Torres, the FBI forensic specialist, read from the intact portion of the dog tags. But ma'am, according to our records, Sergeant Torres was buried at Forest Lawn Cemetery 3 years ago. Maya's laugh came out as a sob. Then who the hell did they bury? The second chamber had been a tomb, sealed with concrete and time. But it wasn't just Danny's remains they'd found. Beside his bones lay the skeleton of a medium-sized dog, its skull bearing the distinctive markings of a Belgian Malinois. Scout, Danny's partner, had been buried alongside him in an unmarked grave, beneath the memorial that bore his name. They killed him here, Maya said, her voice hollow. They killed him stateside and made it look like he died overseas, and they buried him under his own memorial. Agent Sarah Chen, the FBI investigator leading the case, crouched beside Maya. We're still analyzing the evidence from the first chamber, but it's clear that Sergeant Torres was investigating a conspiracy that went very deep. Deep enough that someone was willing to commit murder to protect it. Maya couldn't stop shaking. Ranger pressed against her side, the dog's warmth the only thing keeping her anchored to the present. Everything she'd believed about Danny's death had been a lie. The heroic sacrifice, the tragic loss in Afghanistan, the honor guard at his funeral, all of it fabricated to cover up the truth. The documents in the first chamber, Agent Chen continued, they detail a program called Project Cerberus. It involved experimental procedures on military working dogs, but it was also a cover for arms dealing and intelligence sales to foreign governments. Sergeant Torres had compiled evidence of fraud, animal abuse, and treason. He was preparing to go public when he was killed. Maya's hands clenched into fists. Who? Who killed him? We're still investigating, but the evidence points to a network of officers who were profiting from the program. High-ranking officials who had too much to lose if the truth came out. The memorial grounds had been cleared of visitors, yellow crime scene tape fluttering in the autumn wind. News vans were already arriving, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky like flowers seeking sunlight. By evening, the story would be everywhere. The buried truth beneath the veterans' memorial, the conspiracy that had claimed 2 lives, the dog that had somehow known where to look. But Maya felt empty, hollowed out. She'd spent 3 years mourning a lie, visiting a memorial that was actually a grave marker, believing that Danny had died with honor when he'd actually died, trying to expose the corruption that was poisoning everything he'd sworn to protect. Ma'am, Agent Chen said gently, we'll need to speak with you about your dog. Ranger's behavior suggests she may have encountered Sergeant Torres and Scout before. Any connection between them could be crucial to our investigation. Maya looked down at Ranger, who was watching the excavation site with those intelligent amber eyes. The dog's behavior over the past few weeks suddenly made sense. The restlessness, the whimpering, the way she'd stared at empty corners as if she could see things that weren't there. They knew each other, Maya said. Ranger and Scout. They were trained at the same facility, worked together sometimes. Dogs remember things, sense sounds, emotions. She's been trying to tell me something for months. What kind of something? Maya was quiet for a long moment, watching the forensic team carefully remove evidence from the chambers below. That Danny was still here, that he was still waiting for someone to find him. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the memorial grounds, and Maya found herself thinking about all the visitors who'd come here over the years. Families honoring their dead, veterans paying their respects, school children learning about sacrifice and service. None of them had known they were standing above an unmarked grave, above the remains of a man who died trying to protect the very values the memorial was supposed to represent. "I need to see the evidence," Maya said suddenly. "Everything Danny hid. Everything he died for." Agent Chen hesitated. "Ma'am, some of that material is classified. National security is why he's dead," Maya cut her off. "National security is why they buried him in the dark and lied about how he died. I'm not leaving here until I know the truth. All of it." The agent studied Maya's face, then nodded slowly. "We can arrange a briefing, but you should know what you're asking to see. It's going to be hard to bear." Maya stood slowly, her prosthetic leg aching from kneeling on the cold ground. Ranger rose with her, the dog's presence steady and reassuring. "I've been bearing hard things for 3 years. I can bear this too." But as they walked away from the excavation site, Maya caught her reflection in the memorial's polished granite. Surface, the woman looking back at her was someone she didn't recognize, older, harder, carved by loss and betrayal into something sharp and unforgiving. The naive soldier who'd believed in the mission, who'd trusted the chain of command, who'd thought that honor meant something in the halls of power. That woman was as dead as Danny Torres. What remained was someone new, someone who'd learned that the truth was always buried deeper than you expected, and that sometimes the only way to honor the dead was to dig up what the living wanted to keep hidden. Ranger's nose nudged her hand, and Maya looked down to see the dog watching her with something that looked like understanding. They'd both lost their partners to this war, Scout and the old Maya, buried in different kinds of graves. But they'd found each other, and they'd found the truth. Now came the hardest part, figuring out what to do with it. The wind picked up, rustling through the oak trees and carrying the scent of rain. Maya pulled her jacket tighter around herself and felt the weight of Danny's dog tags in her pocket, the real ones, recovered from the chamber, bearing the dents and scratches of a life cut short by people who valued secrecy over justice. Tomorrow, she would read the files. Tomorrow, she would learn the names of the men who'd ordered Danny's death. Tomorrow, she would begin the long process of seeking justice for the friend she'd never had the chance to properly mourn. But tonight, she would go home and sit with Ranger in the quiet of their apartment, and she would grieve for all the things that had died in that unmarked grave beneath the memorial. Danny and Scout, yes, but also her faith in the system she'd served, her belief that the good guys always won in the end, her trust in the idea that sacrifice meant something to the people who asked you to make it. Tonight she would let herself break, because tomorrow she would have to be strong enough to break something else, the system that had killed her friends. 1 week later, Maya's apartment. The files spread across Maya's living room floor like a map of hell. Photographs of dogs subjected to chemical testing, videos of training sessions that looked more like torture, financial records showing millions of dollars in illegal arms sales. Each document was a piece of a puzzle that revealed the true scope of Project Cerberus, not just a rogue military program, but a criminal enterprise that had infected the highest levels of the Defense Department. Maya sat in the center of it, all her laptop open, cross-referencing names and dates with the methodical precision of a sniper, lining up a shot. Ranger lay beside her, no longer restless but still alert, as if she understood that this was the important work, the reason they'd been brought together. The killers had names now: Colonel Richard Hawthorne, the program's architect; Major Patricia Sims, who'd handled the financial logistics; Captain John Reeves, who'd been responsible for eliminating security threats like Danny Torres; 3 officers with distinguished service records and spotless public reputations, who'd been systematically betraying everything the uniform was supposed to represent. But it was the 4th name that made Maya's blood run cold. General Marcus Webb, her former commanding officer, the man who'd personally decorated her after the IED incident, who'd spoken at her discharge ceremony about honor and sacrifice, who'd looked her in the eye and called her a hero, the same man who'd signed the orders that sent Danny Torres to his death. Maya's hands trembled as she stared at the evidence. Webb had been the ultimate authority behind Project Cerberus, the one who'd approved every illegal experiment, every arms deal, every cover-up. He'd built his career on the blood of soldiers and dogs, and when Danny had threatened to expose the Truth, Webb had eliminated him with the same cold efficiency he'd once applied to military operations. "Son of a bitch," Maya whispered, her voice barely audible. "You lying son of a bitch." The rage came slowly, building like a storm on a distant horizon. Not the hot, impulsive anger she'd felt in the early days after her injury, but something colder, more focused, a fury that had been refined by pain and tempered by purpose. She thought about the night Webb had visited her in the hospital, how he'd sat beside her bed and talked about the sacrifices soldiers made, the importance of serving something larger than themselves, how he'd presented her with a purple heart and told her that her service mattered, that her sacrifice would be remembered, all while knowing that he'd sent her and countless others into harm's way, not for freedom or democracy, but for profit. Maya closed the laptop and stood, her prosthetic leg protesting after hours of sitting on the floor. Ranger rose with her, sensing the change in her mood. The dog's amber eyes were watchful, alert to the shift in energy that signaled action was coming. "They think they won," Maya said, more to herself than to Ranger. "They think they buried the truth along with Danny and Scout. They think they can just keep going, keep profiting from the blood of soldiers and dogs." She walked to the window, looking out at the city lights. Somewhere,